October 15, 2024. Studio 6B at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. The cameras were rolling live when 73-year-old character actor Vincent Marsh walked onto the set of America's most watched late-night show. The host stood up, extended his hand. Vincent smiled, that same disarming smile he'd perfected over 5 decades in Hollywood. What happened next lasted exactly 4 seconds. But those 4 seconds shattered a conspiracy of silence that had protected one of entertainment's darkest secrets for 30 years. 300 miles away in Portland, former TV producer Marcus Holloway dropped his coffee mug and reached for his phone. His hands were shaking. After 7 years of trying to forget, Vincent Marsh was back on television, playing the lovable grandfather America adored. The same man Marcus had seen drag that young production assistant into a dressing room in 1994. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The coffee spread across Marcus's hardwood floor like spilled blood, seeping into the grooves between planks that had witnessed 7 years of his self-imposed exile from the entertainment industry. On the television screen, Vincent Marsh's laugh-filled Studio 6B, that same theatrical chuckle that had once echoed through the corridors of power at Paramount Studios. Marcus's finger hovered over his phone's contact list, trembling like a compass needle searching for true north. Who could he call? Who would believe him? More importantly, who was still alive to corroborate what he'd seen that October night in 1994? The talk show host was leaning forward now, completely charmed by Vincent's anecdote about working with Jimmy Stewart. The audience hung on every word. 3 million viewers at home were probably smiling at their screens, watching America's favorite grandfather figure spin another heartwarming tale from Hollywood's golden age. But Marcus remembered a different Vincent Marsh, the predator who had cornered 22-year-old production assistant Sarah Chen outside the craft services table, who had whispered something that made her face go white, who had guided her, no, dragged her, toward the dressing rooms while the rest of the crew focused on the evening's taping. Marcus had been 31 then, ambitious, hungry for his big break as an associate producer. He'd followed them, thinking he might need to intervene in what looked like an uncomfortable situation. Instead, he'd witnessed something that shattered his faith in the industry he'd dreamed of conquering since childhood. The sound of Sarah's muffled protests through the dressing room door, Vincent's low, threatening voice, the sickening thud of something hitting the wall. Marcus had stood frozen in that hallway for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When the door finally opened, Vincent emerged first, adjusting his tie, that practiced smile already sliding back into place. Sarah came out moments later, her makeup smeared, her blouse torn at the shoulder, her eyes holding a hollow look that would haunt Marcus's dreams for decades. She'd looked directly at him, the only witness to her shame, and shaken her head almost imperceptibly. A plea for silence that he'd honored for 30 years. The next day, Sarah was gone, transferred to another production, the executive said. Better opportunity, they claimed. Marcus never saw her again, though he'd searched for her name in credits and industry directories countless times over the years. On television, Vincent was now discussing his latest project, a family film about a grandfather who teaches his grandson to fly fish. The irony made Marcus's stomach churn. 3 million people were watching a predator market himself as a wholesome father figure, and they had no idea. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number still watching old friends on TV. Marcus? The blood drained from his face. The message had been sent 30 seconds ago. Someone was watching him. Someone who knew what he'd witnessed. Marcus moved to his living room window and peered through the blinds at the quiet Portland street below. Nothing unusual, just Mrs. Patterson walking her golden retriever and the college student from across the street struggling with grocery bags. But the feeling of being observed crawled across his skin like insects. Another text, Vincent's looking good for his age, don't you think? Time has been kind to him. Marcus's hands shook as he typed back. Who is this? The response was immediate. Someone who remembers that night as clearly as you do. Someone who's been keeping track of all the witnesses. All the witnesses. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. There had been others who knew. Of course there had been. This was Hollywood, where secrets were currency and leverage was power. But who else had seen Vincent's true nature? And what did keeping track mean? A third message arrived with a photo attachment. Marcus's finger hesitated over the screen before opening it. The image made his knees buckle. It was a newspaper clipping from the Portland Tribune, dated 6 months ago. The headline read, "Former TV director found dead in apparent suicide." Below it was a photo of Robert Kellerman, a man Marcus remembered from the Paramount lot. Someone who might have known about Vincent. Someone who might have finally decided to speak up. The final text was the most chilling. 3 down, 2 to go. Don't make this harder than it has to be, Marcus. On the television, Vincent Marsh was signing autographs for audience members, his grandfatherly persona gleaming under the studio lights. The host shook his hand again, completely oblivious to the monster he was embracing. Marcus turned off the TV with shaking fingers and double-checked the locks on his front door. Outside, Portland's autumn darkness pressed against his windows like black water, and somewhere in that darkness, someone was watching, waiting, counting down the witnesses to Vincent Marsh's crimes. The conspiracy of silence Marcus had helped maintain was collapsing, and the people who knew the truth were dying one by one. If you're following Marcus's terrifying journey and want to see how he'll survive the night ahead, hit that subscribe button now. Tomorrow's chapter reveals the true scope of Vincent's crimes and the deadly network protecting him. Don't miss what happens when Marcus discovers he's not the hunter, he's the prey. Marcus set his phone face down on the coffee table, as if the device itself had become radioactive. The threatening messages burned in his memory, but for a moment he forced himself to breathe, to remember who he was now, who he'd built himself into during these 7 years of carefully constructed peace. The hardwood floor where he'd spilled his coffee reflected the soft amber glow of the vintage Edison bulb lamp, a gift from Elena when he'd first bought this modest craftsman house in southeast Portland. She'd said the warm light would help him sleep better, help quiet the nightmares that had followed him from Los Angeles like faithful, hungry dogs. Elena. The thought of her sent a different kind of panic through his chest. Thursday nights meant she was at her pottery class at the community center, her gentle hands shaping clay while she laughed with the other women about their grown children and weekend plans. She'd be home by 9:30, humming softly as she made chamomile tea, completely unaware that the man she'd been sharing her bed with for 3 years was being hunted by ghosts from a life he'd never fully explained. Marcus walked to the kitchen and pulled Elena's latest ceramic bowl from the shelf, glazed in deep blue with tiny silver stars she'd painted around the rim. She made functional art, she always said with a self-deprecating smile, as if beauty that served a purpose was somehow less valuable than beauty that simply existed. The bowl felt solid in his hands, real, connected to this life he'd built in Portland, where he was simply Marcus the documentary filmmaker, not Marcus the former TV producer who'd run from Los Angeles with his conscience in tatters. The documentary company, Holloway Media, operated out of the converted garage behind the house. Modest projects, mostly, local environmental stories, profiles of Pacific Northwest artists, the occasional corporate training video that paid the bills. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would put his name in industry trades or draw attention from his past. His last project had been about the declining salmon runs in the Columbia River, spending weeks with a Native American fisherman named Joseph, who'd taught him that some traditions were worth preserving even when the world around them was changing. "Truth has its own current," Joseph had said while casting his net into the dawn-lit water. "You can fight it, redirect it, dam it up for a while, but eventually it finds its way to the surface." Marcus had included that quote in the final documentary, never imagining how prophetic it would prove to be. He moved through the house now, touching familiar objects like talismans. The antique typewriter Elena had found at an estate sale, claiming it would inspire him to write the novel he'd mentioned once in passing. The framed photo of them hiking Mount Hood last spring, Elena's face flushed and radiant against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks, the small succulent garden she'd started on the kitchen windowsill, each plant carefully labeled with names like Desert Rose and String of Hearts in her precise handwriting. This was what he stood to lose. This quiet life with a woman who trusted him completely, who'd never asked too many questions about why he'd left television so abruptly, who accepted his explanation that he'd simply burned out on the industry's superficiality. Elena worked as a pediatric nurse at OHSU, spending her days caring for sick children with the same gentle competence she brought to everything else. She believed in healing, in second chances, in the fundamental goodness of people. What would she think if she knew he'd spent 30 years as an accessory to a crime, that he'd chosen career preservation over justice, that his silence might have enabled other attacks, other victims? The autumn wind rattled the windows, and Marcus found himself studying every shadow in the yard. The old maple tree Elena loved for its brilliant red leaves now seemed ominous, its branches reaching toward the house like gnarled fingers. The neighbor's security light cast harsh angles across the fence, creating pockets of darkness where someone could easily hide. His phone buzzed again. Marcus stared at the device for a full minute before picking it up. Not another unknown number this time. The caller ID showed Blue Point Investigations, a name that meant nothing to him. He let it ring through to voicemail, then immediately played the message back. "Mr. Holloway, this is Detective Sarah Chen with the Portland Police Bureau. I need to speak with you about some threats you may have received tonight. I'm in the area and would like to stop by if you're available. I think you'll find we have a lot to discuss." The voice was older now, weathered by 3 decades, but Marcus recognized it immediately. The same Sarah Chen whose muffled protests he'd heard through that dressing room door. The production assistant whose pleading look had bought his silence for 30 years. She was alive, she was a police detective, and somehow she knew exactly what was happening to him tonight. Outside, headlights swept across his living room windows as a car pulled slowly into his driveway. Elena's ceramic bowl still clutched in his hands as the headlights cut through his carefully maintained sanctuary. The engine outside shut off with a mechanical finality that seemed to close the door on 7 years of self-imposed exile. Sarah Chen, Detective Sarah Chen, was here, and with her arrival, the last threads connecting him to his Portland life were beginning to fray. He set the bowl down with exaggerated care, his movements deliberate and controlled even as his mind raced. Through the window he watched a figure emerge from what looked like an unmarked sedan, a woman in her early 50s, medium height, moving with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to confronting uncomfortable truths. Even in the amber glow of the porch light, he could see the echoes of the young production assistant who had pleaded for his silence 3 decades ago. The doorbell rang once, followed by 3 firm knocks. "Mr. Holloway, it's Detective Chen. I believe you're expecting me." Marcus approached the door, but didn't immediately open it. His hand rested on the deadbolt Elena had insisted they install after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood last winter. Such a simple precaution then, born from everyday urban concerns. Now it felt like the flimsiest barrier between his constructed life and the abyss that had been chasing him since Los Angeles. "How did you get my address?" he called through the door. "I've known where you were for quite some time, Marcus. May I come in? We have a great deal to discuss and not much time to do it." Her voice carried an authority that hadn't existed when she was 22 and trembling in a studio hallway. Whatever had happened to Sarah Chen after she disappeared from Paramount, it had forged her into something harder, more dangerous than the frightened young woman whose silence he had purchased with his cowardice. Marcus opened the door. Sarah Chen stood on his porch wearing a charcoal wool coat and an expression that suggested she'd been preparing for this conversation for years. Her dark hair was streaked with silver and pulled back severely, and her eyes, those same eyes that had begged him for silence, now studied him with the clinical assessment of someone who had spent decades cataloging the lies people told themselves. "You look older," she said, stepping past him into the living room without invitation. Softer. "Portland's been good to you. I thought you were dead." The words escaped before Marcus could stop them. Vincent certainly tried to ensure that. Sarah moved through his living room like she was documenting evidence, taking note of Elena's pottery, the hiking photos, the succulent garden visible through the kitchen doorway. "Cozy life you've built here, very different from the glamour of television production." "Sarah, Marcus began, but she held up a hand. "Detective Chen, please. We're well past the point of first names." She turned to face him fully, and Marcus saw something in her expression that made his stomach clench. Not just anger, though there was certainly that, but pity. the look of someone about to deliver devastating news to the bereaved. You received some threatening messages tonight. It wasn't a question. You know about the texts? I know about a great deal more than that. Sarah reached into her coat and withdrew a manila folder, thick with documents. I know that Robert Kellerman didn't commit suicide 6 months ago. I know that Tom Brennan, the sound engineer from Studio B, died in a car accident in Burbank 3 years ago that wasn't an accident. I know that Janet Mills, the script supervisor who worked nights that week, suffered a home invasion in Phoenix 18 months ago that the local police closed as a robbery gone wrong. Marcus felt the room tilt slightly, as if the foundation of his house had shifted. Janet's dead? They're all dead, Marcus. Every person who worked late that night, every potential witness to what Vincent did to me. Sarah opened the folder and spread photographs across Elena's coffee table. Crime scene photos, newspaper clippings, coroner's reports. Everyone except you. The images blurred together. Robert's body hanging from a garage beam. Tom's crushed Volvo wrapped around a freeway barrier. Janet's ransacked apartment with her body sprawled across the hardwood floor. Marcus recognized faces from the studio. People he'd shared coffee and gossip with. Reduced now to evidence photos in a folder that documented 30 years of systematic murder. Why? Marcus whispered. Why are you still alive? Sarah's smile was bitter as winter rain, because I became useful to certain people, because I learned to play the game better than Vincent ever imagined. She closed the folder with a sharp snap, and because I've been waiting for the right moment to destroy him completely. Outside, another car was pulling into the driveway. Sarah glanced toward the window, her expression suddenly tense. That's not one of mine, she said, reaching for something beneath her coat. Marcus, I need you to listen very carefully. Your quiet little life just ended forever. Marcus stumbled backward from the window, his mind rejecting what Sarah had just said. No, this is insane. I'm calling the police. I am the police, Sarah snapped, her hand still hovering near whatever weapon she carried beneath her coat. And that car outside means we're out of time for explanations. But Marcus wasn't listening. The folder of death certificates, the casual way Sarah discussed 30 years of murder, the complete destruction of his carefully rebuilt world. It was too much. His documentary filmmaker's mind, trained to organize chaos into coherent narrative, simply shut down. I need you to leave. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow and distant. Elena will be home soon, and I won't have her dragged into this nightmare. Whatever this is, whatever you think I can help you with, I can't. I won't. Sarah stared at him with something approaching disbelief. Marcus, they've spent 3 decades systematically murdering everyone who knew what Vincent did. You're the last witness left alive, and you think you can just ask me to leave? Yes. Marcus moved toward his front door, muscle memory of normal life overriding the horror Sarah had spread across Elena's coffee table. I think you should go, both of you, whoever's in that car. I don't want any part of this. He reached for the doorknob, some desperate part of his mind convinced that if he could just get Sarah to leave, if he could return to the quiet evening he'd been living an hour ago, none of this would be real. Elena would come home humming from pottery class, they'd share chamomile tea and stories about their day, and Vincent Marsh would return to being just another actor on television, instead of a monster from his past. Don't. Sarah's voice cut through his delusion like ice water. Don't open that door. Something in her tone made Marcus freeze. Through the window he could see the second car now, a dark sedan with tinted windows, engine still running. No one had gotten out. It just sat there in his driveway like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Who is it? Marcus whispered. Vincent's people. They've been watching you for months, probably longer. The moment I showed up here, they knew the game had changed. Sarah moved away from the window, positioning herself where she couldn't be seen from outside. Your neighbor across the street, the college student with the grocery bags, he's been there for 6 weeks, documenting your routine. Elena's pottery class, your morning coffee runs, the time you spend working in your garage. They know everything about your life, Marcus, the student. Marcus remembered noticing him, even thinking it was nice to see young people investing in the neighborhood's sense of community. How many other details of his life had he misinterpreted? How long had he been living in an elaborate cage thinking he was free? His phone buzzed. Elena's name appeared on the screen, and Marcus answered without thinking. "Hey, babe." Elena's voice was warm and tired, filled with the contentment that always followed her pottery sessions. "Class ran a little late tonight. Janet brought her grandson to show off his school art project. I'm stopping by the store to grab ingredients for tomorrow's dinner. Do we have enough olive oil?" Marcus opened his mouth to warn her, to tell her to drive straight to the police station or her sister's house in Vancouver, anywhere but here. But Sarah was shaking her head sharply, drawing a finger across her throat in a cutting motion. "We're fine on oil," Marcus managed, his voice barely steady. "Take your time. You sound weird. Everything okay?" Through the window, Marcus watched the dark sedan's passenger door finally open. A man emerged, tall, heavy-set, moving with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. He walked directly toward Marcus's front porch, not bothering with pretense or stealth. "Everything's perfect." Marcus lied to the woman he loved. "See you when you get home." He ended the call as the stranger's footsteps reached his door. No knock, no doorbell, just a voice, cultured and pleasant, speaking through the wood. "Mr. Holloway, my name is David Castellanos. I represent certain interests that would prefer this evening's conversation remain private. I'm hoping we can resolve this situation like civilized people." Sarah had gone completely still, her face pale in the amber lamplight. When she whispered, her voice carried 30 years of accumulated terror. "That's him. That's Vincent's cleaner. Marcus, everyone who ever heard that voice ended up in my folder." Outside, David Castellanos continued speaking in his reasonable, friendly tone. "We know Detective Chen is inside with you, Mr. Holloway. We know she's shared some disturbing allegations about Mr. Marsh. Unfortunately, Detective Chen has been struggling with some serious mental health issues lately. Her superiors are quite concerned about her stability. The civilized monster on his porch was systematically destroying Sarah's credibility, even as he prepared to destroy them both." And Elena was driving home through the autumn darkness, humming and planning tomorrow's dinner, with no idea that the life she was returning to had already ceased to exist. Marcus felt the walls of his carefully constructed world collapsing inward like a house of cards in a windstorm. David Castellanos' voice continued its reasonable monologue through the door, each word delivered with the practiced ease of a man who had refined this particular performance over decades. "Mr. Holloway, I understand this situation is distressing. Detective Chen has been pursuing a personal vendetta against Mr. Marsh for quite some time. Her colleagues at Portland PD have documented increasingly erratic behavior, missed shifts, unauthorized investigations, paranoid delusions about conspiracies that simply don't exist." Sarah's weapon was in her hand now, a compact pistol that she held with the steady grip of someone who'd learned to shoot long after that terrified night in the studio. Her eyes never left the door as she whispered, "He's building a narrative, making it look like I snapped, forced my way in here, threatened you. When the real police find our bodies, it'll be a tragedy, unstable detective, murder-suicide." Marcus stared at her, his documentary filmmaker's mind finally grasping the full scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about silencing witnesses anymore. This was about rewriting history itself, turning victims into villains and ensuring that Vincent Marsh's carefully maintained public image survived intact. "How many others?" Marcus's voice was barely audible. "How many times has he done this exact thing?" Robert received a visit from Mr. Castellanos 2 days before his suicide. The Phoenix police found evidence that Janet had been researching Vincent online for weeks before her death, downloading old production schedules, trying to piece together who else had been there that night. Sarah's face was granite, carved from 30 years of accumulated rage. She was going to come forward, Marcus. After 3 decades of silence, she was finally ready to speak. The weight of that revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Janet Mills, quiet, methodical Janet who'd always arrived early and stayed late, who'd brought homemade cookies to the crew every Friday, had found the courage he'd never possessed. She'd decided to break the silence that had protected a monster for 30 years, and it had cost her everything. Mr. Holloway, Castellanos continued from the porch, I'm afraid time is becoming a factor. Detective Chen is clearly experiencing a psychotic break. The longer we delay intervention, the more dangerous she becomes. I have medical professionals standing by to ensure she receives the help she desperately needs. Medical professionals. Marcus understood the euphemism now. He thought of Elena's gentle hands shaping clay, creating beauty from formless earth, and felt something fundamental break inside his chest. She would come home to find police cars and ambulances. Her quiet life shattered by violence she could never have imagined. She'd spend the rest of her days wondering what signs she'd missed, what she could have done differently. There's another way, Sarah said suddenly, reading something in his expression. The back door leads to your garage, right? From there we can reach the alley behind your house. Marcus nodded, though his mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating the impossible mathematics of escape. Elena parks in the driveway. When she comes home, if we're lucky, we'll be long gone before she arrives. Sarah moved toward the kitchen, staying low beneath the window sight lines. If we're unlucky, she'll see the cars and keep driving. But Marcus knew Elena better than that. She'd see strange vehicles in their driveway and assume something had happened to him. She'd rush inside, calling his name, walking directly into whatever trap Castellanos was preparing. The woman who spent her days healing sick children would become collateral damage in a war she didn't even know existed. No, Marcus said, the word emerging from some deep well of certainty he hadn't known he possessed. I'm not running anymore. Sarah spun toward him, incredulous. Marcus, this isn't some documentary subject you can interview your way out of. These people have been killing for 30 years. Because people like me let them. Marcus felt the truth of it settle into his bones like lead. Because I was more concerned with protecting my career than protecting you. Because I convinced myself that staying silent was the pragmatic choice. Outside, Castellanos had stopped talking. The silence felt more ominous than his reasonable threats. They're moving, Sarah whispered, pressing herself against the wall beside the front window. 2 more vehicles just pulled up. They're not planning to make this look like a simple murder-suicide anymore. Marcus understood. Too many witnesses now, too many complications. They were going to stage something bigger, a home invasion perhaps, or a gas leak explosion, something that would eliminate both him and Sarah, while providing a plausible explanation for Elena when she arrived to find nothing but ashes and investigators offering their condolences. 30 years, Marcus said quietly. Looking around the living room Elena had filled with pottery and plants and photographs of their life together. 30 years of people dying because I was a coward. The back door seemed very far away. Sarah was moving toward the kitchen when Marcus's phone rang again. Elena's name lit up the screen, and something in Sarah's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition that made Marcus's blood turn to ice. Don't answer it, Sarah said, but her voice carried a strange urgency that had nothing to do with the men outside. Marcus stared at her, his thumb hovering over the phone. She's probably calling because she saw the cars. Marcus, don't. Sarah's weapon was still drawn, but now it seemed less like protection and more like a threat. Put the phone down. The ringing continued, Elena's photo smiling up at him from the screen. A snapshot from their hiking trip to Mount Hood last spring, her face radiant with joy and completely unaware that her life was built on a foundation of lies. Marcus felt something cold and terrible spreading through his chest as he met Sarah's eyes. You knew, he whispered. You knew she was calling. Sarah's face had gone completely blank, the mask of 30 years of deception finally slipping. Marcus, how did you know? His voice was getting louder, beyond caring if Castellanos heard him through the door. How could you possibly know Elena was about to call unless... The phone stopped ringing. In the sudden silence, Marcus heard Elena's voicemail greeting begin to play from somewhere else in the house, from the bedroom, from Elena's phone, which should have been with her at the pottery studio. Marcus ran toward the back of the house, Sarah calling his name behind him, but he was already pushing through the bedroom door. Elena's purse sat on their dresser, her phone beside it, the call log showing 17 missed calls to his number over the past 2 hours. Her car keys glinted in the lamplight. Elena had never left for pottery class. Marcus turned slowly, his mind rejecting what his eyes were telling him, as Sarah appeared in the doorway. The weapon in her hands was steady, professional, and pointed directly at his chest. "She's been gone since Tuesday," Sarah said quietly. "We needed you isolated, focused, emotional. People make different choices when they're desperate to protect someone they love." The room spun around Marcus as 30 years of assumptions crumbled like sand castles. "Where is she?" "Safe. For now." Sarah's voice had lost all pretense of the haunted victim she'd been playing. "Vincent sends his regards, by the way. He was quite impressed that you managed to stay hidden for so long." "Vincent," Marcus felt the words stick in his throat like broken glass. "You work for Vincent. I work for the people who own Vincent. The same people who've been watching you build this beautiful little life for 7 years, waiting for the right moment to use it." Sarah tilted her head, studying him with scientific curiosity. "Did you really think we'd just forget about you, Marcus? The last witness to Vincent's indiscretion? The one loose thread that could unravel everything if someone pulled it hard enough?" The folder of crime scene photos lay scattered across Elena's handmade coffee table. Real deaths, real murders, but not random killings by Vincent's cleanup crew. They were warnings, demonstrations of what happened to people who tried to run from obligations they could never escape. The others, Marcus said numbly. Robert, Janet, Tom, they weren't talking, they were being recruited. Robert chose poorly, Janet as well. Tom actually showed promise, but he developed inconvenient moral qualms. Sarah's smile was winter cold. "We're hoping you'll be more pragmatic." Through the window, Marcus could see David Castellanos still standing on the porch, patient as death itself. Not a cleaner sent to eliminate witnesses, a talent scout, ensuring that Marcus understood the terms of his new employment. "What do you want?" "Your documentary company has an impeccable reputation for investigating corruption, exposing inconvenient truths. Imagine how much credibility a film would have if Marcus Holloway himself debunked the ridiculous conspiracy theories about Vincent Marsh." Sarah's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd been planning this conversation for years. The same Marcus Holloway who worked at Paramount during the relevant period, who had access to the real facts, who can speak with absolute authority about what did and didn't happen in Studio B that night. Marcus understood now why they'd let him run, let him build a new life in Portland. They'd been cultivating him like a crop, waiting for him to ripen into exactly the kind of credible witness who could destroy any future accusations against Vincent. His years of documentary work, his reputation for honesty, his status as a reformed industry insider. It was all currency they intended to spend. "And if I refuse?" Sarah's expression didn't change. "Elena teaches at Roosevelt Elementary, doesn't she? Room 14, second grade. 23 children who trust her completely." The phone in Marcus's hand buzzed with an incoming text, a photograph of Elena bound to a chair, her eyes wide with terror above a strip of duct tape. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows, Marcus could see the unmistakable silhouette of a man he'd spent 30 years trying to forget. Vincent Marsh, still charming even in the darkness, smiled directly at the camera. The photograph burned itself into Marcus's retinas like acid. Elena's eyes, wide with terror above the duct tape, searching desperately for understanding in a world that had suddenly revealed its capacity for unthinkable cruelty. But it was Vincent's smile that shattered the last of Marcus's illusions. That same practiced expression of benevolent authority he'd wielded on television screens for decades, now deployed in service of pure malice. "You bastards," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "She has nothing to do with this." "She has everything to do with this." Sarah's weapon never wavered. "She's the reason you'll make the right choice. The reason you'll sit in front of cameras and explain to the world how dangerous conspiracy theories can destroy innocent lives. How good men like Vincent Marsh become victims of false accusations spread by mentally unstable individuals who can't separate fiction from reality." Marcus stared at Elena's terrified face on the phone screen, feeling something fundamental breaking apart in his chest. 7 years of quiet mornings, of shared coffee and gentle conversation, of building a life based on the illusion that he could escape the consequences of his cowardice. Elena had loved a ghost, a carefully constructed fiction of the man he might have been, if he'd possessed an ounce of courage when it mattered. The documentary, he said slowly, pieces of their elaborate plan falling into place. How long do I have? Filming begins Monday. Vincent is quite excited to participate. He's always enjoyed the opportunity to set the record straight. Sarah's smile was surgical in its precision. We'll start with the basic facts. Studio B was being renovated that night. No one could have been inside. Vincent was at a charity gala with 300 witnesses. The entire story is the product of trauma-induced false memory syndrome spread by individuals seeking attention or financial gain. Monday. 4 days to construct a lie so comprehensive it would bury the truth forever. Marcus thought of his small crew. Jenny, his editor, who'd followed him from Los Angeles because she believed in honest storytelling. Mike, his cameraman, who'd quit network television to work on projects that mattered. They'd help him craft this obscenity because they trusted him, because they believed Marcus Holloway stood for something more than survival at any cost. People will investigate, Marcus said desperately. Other journalists, real detectives, will find exactly what we want them to find. Production schedules showing Studio B was sealed for asbestos removal. Security footage of Vincent at the Beverly Hills Hotel, charming donors for his Children's Literacy Foundation. Medical records documenting the psychological instability of everyone who ever claimed to witness something that night. Sarah moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. We've had 30 years to perfect this story, Marcus. Every loose end tied off, every contradiction explained away. All we needed was someone with your particular reputation to give it credibility. Through the wall, Marcus could hear David Castellanos speaking quietly into his phone, coordinating details with the calm efficiency of a man managing a routine business transaction. How many other documentaries had they sponsored over the years? How many filmmakers had been turned into unwitting accomplices, their integrity purchased with threats disguised as protection? His phone buzzed again. Another photograph, this one showing Elena's bound hands, the delicate fingers that shaped clay into art now trembling against rough rope. But it was the timestamp that made Marcus's blood freeze. The image had been taken 17 minutes ago. Elena wasn't just alive. She was close enough for Vincent to send real-time updates, to demonstrate his absolute control over every aspect of Marcus's existence. She's here, Marcus realized, his voice hollow with defeat. In Portland. Vincent wanted to supervise personally. He has such fond memories of your last conversation. Sarah tilted her head, studying Marcus's face with clinical interest. Do you remember what you said that night, after you watched him destroy that girl and decided silence was the better part of valor? Marcus remembered. He'd followed Vincent out of Studio B in a daze, barely comprehending what he'd witnessed. In the parking lot, under the pale glow of security lights, he'd found his voice long enough to stammer a single question. Why? Vincent had straightened his tie with the same casual gesture he'd use, adjusting his costume between takes, his smile never flickering. Because I could, he'd said simply. Because power without the freedom to exercise it is just an elaborate prison. And because young people like that learn such valuable lessons about the true nature of the world. Then he'd clapped Marcus on the shoulder with paternal warmth. You understand, of course, that certain experiences are too complex for public consumption. The audience prefers simple stories with clear moral boundaries. Much better for everyone involved. Now, 30 years later, Marcus finally understood that Vincent's explanation had been both confession and recruitment. The monster had been gauging his reaction, determining whether Marcus possessed the moral flexibility necessary for long-term collaboration. His silence that night hadn't been cowardice. It had been an audition. And apparently, after 3 decades of quiet complicity, he'd finally proven himself ready for the starring role. No, Marcus said, the word emerging from a place deeper than fear, deeper than self-preservation. I won't do it. Sarah's eyebrows lifted with genuine surprise. Marcus, I don't think you understand I understand perfectly. Marcus set the phone on Elena's dresser, face down, unable to bear the sight of her terror any longer. 30 years ago, I watched Vincent destroy an innocent girl and chose silence because I was afraid. I've been making that same choice every day since, and now Elena's paying the price for my cowardice. Then you'll make the documentary. Sarah's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining simple mathematics to a child. "You'll save her life, and your own, and everyone moves forward." Marcus shook his head, feeling something shift inside his chest like tectonic plates finding their true alignment. "You're going to kill us anyway, both of us. You can't risk Elena knowing what she's seen, and you can't trust me to stay bought forever." He met Sarah's eyes directly for the first time since she dropped her mask. "The only question is whether I die as the same coward who walked away from Studio B, or as someone who finally found the courage to do what's right." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Sarah's features. This wasn't the script they'd written for him, the desperate man choosing love over principle, trading truth for Elena's safety in a bargain they'd never honor. "The children at Roosevelt Elementary," Sarah said, her weapon steady despite the doubt in her voice. 23 7-year-olds who trust Elena completely. Do they deserve to suffer because you've suddenly discovered a conscience? Marcus thought of Elena's stories about her students. Little Maria, who struggled with reading, James, who brought her drawings of dinosaurs, Amy, who stayed after school because her mother worked late. Innocent lives that would be shattered if Vincent's network decided to make an example of collective punishment. The arithmetic of evil, calculating how much pain would purchase his silence. "They deserve to live in a world where monsters like Vincent can't hurt them," Marcus said quietly. "And that only happens if someone finally tells the truth." Through the bedroom wall, he could hear Castellanos ending his phone call. The coordination phase was complete. Whatever they'd planned would happen soon, with or without Marcus's cooperation. But he could also hear something else, the distant sound of approaching vehicles. Engines that didn't match the careful whisper of the surveillance cars that had been watching his house. Sarah heard it too. Her head tilted toward the window, professional instincts overriding her careful psychological manipulation. "That's not part of our—" The front door exploded inward with a crash that shook the entire house. Men's voices shouting commands, boots pounding across Elena's carefully arranged living room, the controlled chaos of law enforcement executing a high-risk warrant. Marcus heard Castellanos' surprised curse from the porch, then the distinctive crack of a taser and his heavy body hitting the wooden boards. "FBI, drop your weapon." Sarah spun toward the bedroom door, her gun tracking toward the approaching voices, and Marcus made a choice that felt like stepping off a cliff into freefall. He lunged forward, not trying to disarm her, but simply throwing his body between Sarah and the federal agents, whose presence meant Elena might still have a chance. The gun went off inches from his ear, the sound like a thunderclap in the enclosed space. Marcus felt the bullet pass so close to his head that the displaced air stirred his hair, but he was already colliding with Sarah, driving her back against Elena's dresser. The mirror shattered behind them in a cascade of silver fragments that caught the afternoon light like falling stars. Sarah was stronger than he'd expected, trained in ways that his 7 years of comfortable retirement hadn't prepared him for. She drove an elbow toward his solar plexus with professional precision, but desperation made him faster than technique. His hand closed over her wrist, forcing the weapon toward the ceiling as it discharged again, plaster raining down on them like snow. "Gun! Gun!" The FBI agents burst through the bedroom door in tactical formation, their own weapons drawn. And suddenly the small space was filled with shouting voices and the red dots of laser sights painting abstract patterns across the walls Elena had decorated with their photographs. Sarah's resistance collapsed all at once, professionalism overriding desperation as she recognized the futility of fighting federal agents in an enclosed space. The gun clattered to the floor among the mirror fragments, and Marcus found himself gasping against the dresser, his hands shaking with adrenaline and the accumulated terror of 30 years. Marcus Holloway? The lead agent was a woman in her 40s, her voice carrying calm authority despite the chaos. "Agent Jennifer Walsh, FBI. We need to talk about Vincent Marsh, and we need to talk about Elena." Marcus looked up at her, hope and fear warring in his chest like opposing armies. "Is she alive?" Agent Walsh's expression softened fractionally. "We're going to find her. But first, you're going to tell us everything." Marcus sat in the sterile FBI conference room, watching Portland's October rain streak the windows like tears he'd finally learned to shed. 6 months had passed since Agent Walsh's tactical team had shattered his living room door, since he'd spoken Vincent's name aloud to someone who could actually do something about it. The words had poured out of him like poison from a lanced wound. 30 years of accumulated silence flowing into digital recorders that transformed his cowardice into evidence. They'd found Elena in a warehouse near the river, bound but alive, her eyes holding the same shell-shocked expression Marcus recognized from his own mirror. Vincent had been there too, along with 2 of his handlers, caught in the act of orchestrating Marcus's recruitment. The charming television icon had maintained his practiced smile even in handcuffs, offering the arresting agents autographs and jokes about method acting gone too far. The trial had lasted 4 months. Marcus testified for 6 hours spread across 3 days, his voice steady as he described what he'd witnessed in Studio B. The defense attorneys painted him as a mentally unstable has-been seeking attention, but the prosecution had Vincent's own recorded words from the warehouse, threats and confessions spoken with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never imagined consequences. The jury convicted on all counts. Vincent Marsh, beloved comedy icon and children's literacy advocate, would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. 7 other members of his network had been arrested across 3 states, their carefully constructed empire of silence collapsing like a house built on sand. Marcus should have felt vindicated. Justice, delayed by 3 decades but finally delivered. Instead, he felt only the weight of all the victims who'd died waiting for someone to find the courage he'd lacked. Elena had left him 2 weeks after returning home. She'd tried to rebuild their life, had gone through the motions of normalcy for months, but something fundamental had broken that couldn't be repaired with patience and shared coffee. Not the trauma of her kidnapping. She was stronger than that. What she couldn't forgive was discovering that the man she'd loved for 7 years had been built on a foundation of calculated silence, that every gentle morning they'd shared had been purchased with someone else's pain. "You're not the person I thought I knew," she'd said the night she packed her bags. "And I don't think you are either." She wasn't wrong. The Marcus who'd chosen comfort over conscience had died the moment he'd stepped between Sarah's gun and those FBI agents. What remained was harder to define. Neither the coward who'd fled Los Angeles nor the false prophet who'd pretended virtue in Portland. Something raw, more honest, carrying scars that would never fully heal. His documentary company had folded within a month of the arrests. No one wanted to work with the producer who'd harbored such secrets, who'd built a reputation for honesty while living the most fundamental lie. Jenny had been the most disappointed, her faith in his integrity so complete that his revelations had felt like personal betrayal. She'd moved to Seattle, started her own production company, sent him a single text, "I hope it was worth it." He wasn't sure how to answer that. Worth Elena's kidnapping? Worth the collapse of everything he'd built? Worth 30 years of nightmares and the knowledge that his silence had enabled other horrors he'd never know about? But when he'd watched Vincent's sentencing on the courthouse steps, when he'd seen the families of confirmed victims weeping with relief, when reporters had read the names of young people who'd finally received justice, in those moments, Marcus had felt something approaching peace. Now he worked part-time at a non-profit in southeast Portland, helping survivors of assault navigate the legal system. The pay barely covered his small apartment's rent, but the work felt clean in a way his previous life never had. He helped people find their voices when the system tried to silence them, guided them through processes designed to exhaust their resolve. Sometimes, late at night in his sparse one-bedroom, Marcus would remember the weight of Elena's hand in his, the sound of her laughter over morning coffee, the life they'd built together in the space between his secrets. The grief was sharp enough to steal his breath, but it felt earned in a way his previous contentment never had. He'd destroyed everything he'd loved to do what should have been done 30 years ago. There was no redemption in that arithmetic, no clean moral victory, just the terrible necessity of finally telling a truth that should never have needed telling. The rain continued against the windows, washing Portland clean for another day. Marcus gathered his files and prepared to help another survivor find the courage he'd spent 3 decades learning to claim. Outside, the city moved forward with the patient persistence of water carving stone, and somewhere in that ordinary progression, Marcus had finally learned to live with himself.